Here we're looking at the standalone version of Mixbox. Now, it works similarly to the plugin version, but there are some additional functions and features which we'll look at. Now, first of all, why would you want to use Mixbox in a standalone mode versus in a DAW? Well, it's great for live performance on stage. Let's say you want to use it as an effects processor for your band. You could run the bass into one rack, the guitar into another one, the vocals into another, keyboards into another, and do all your processing and submixing within this, and then output it to your audio interface to either multiple outputs or one combined output for your PA system. You can also use it on a second computer that's dedicated to virtual instruments. If you're a keyboard player triggering soft synths, this could be great for processing them. So by default, one full rack is displayed here, empty in this case, but we do have up to 8 full racks available. And we get to those from the navigation bar at the top of the interface, and it displays thumbnails of each one. They're all empty now. So let me go to the first one. And let's say, for example, I was going to run my bass into the first one, go into the second rack, and maybe there I'm going to run my guitar. And maybe in the third rack, I have my vocalist going in for some vocal processing, and I'm going to go female pop preset for now. So you can see here that we can move between the separate racks from this navigation bar, and we can power each one on and off like that. And we can also move between them from the bottom here in this field. There's rack 1, rack 2, and it updates what's highlighted with the orange halo, and rack 3. Now, in addition to the rack edit panel, like we saw in the plugin version, we have the rack overview button that we get to up here, and we can manage all the different racks from here as well. So let's look at the setup to start out with. We have the gear or action menu here, and I'm going to open this. And first we have the audio MIDI setup where we can choose for input and output which audio device we're using. In my case, I'm going to set it to my multi-in and out Thunderbolt Universal Audio Apollo. And we can set the sample rate, the buffer size, and for MIDI input, we can choose what devices we want to be able to trigger the setup in here. Now here's where all the meat and potatoes is, the I/O setup. We have this familiar looking grid, which if you've used Pro Tools or many DAWs, you'll be used to how this is set up. But the idea is that we set for the input and output which rack is going to address which inputs and outputs. Now to start with, we have a format button so we can run them in mono or stereo. Now let's say, for example, I was using this for live use. I'd probably be running this in mono. Of course, not every setup is like that, but to keep it simple, we can do it like that. So I can route rack 1. This is the input to my channel 1 here. I'm going to turn these off because I have my mic plugged in here, so I don't want to get a live input for this. So let's say rack 3, I want input signal from here. This would be a typical kind of grid setting. So if I had my bass plugged into 1, it would be here, my guitar over here, like I set up a moment ago. So this is how I might set the grid up for the inputs. Now the core audio driver is what's returning these labels here. So yours will look different depending on what audio interface you're using, but these are for the Apollo. Now for the output, it's similar. And again, you might want to run in mono or stereo for live use, but let's say I'm going to do it like this. And just for a simple setup, let's say I want rack 1 to output through here, rack 2 to output there, rack 3 to output to line output, etc. So they each have a unique output on the audio interface that can go into a mixing board or into the PA system or whatever. So let's say I'm ready to save this setup. I have a save box here where I can name it. And again, like we saw in the plugin version, this will take me to the folder that it's stored in by default, and I can change the location if I want. But we're in Documents, IK Multimedia, Mixbox, and here we have I/O presets. There's none to start with, but that's where they're saved by default. And we can also, of course, load settings from there. The Info tab will bring up product information, and the lock icon opens the product manager. Now let's take a closer look at the rack overview, which we get at with this button in the upper left. There's a power button for each of the racks in this view, and you see they get shaded out when we mute them here or bypass them there. And we can load modules into each slot in each rack with these arrow buttons. We get the familiar categories and then individual modules. And the modules displayed inside each rack can be swapped. We just click and drag and move them around like that. And we can load or save full rack setups at the bottom. So there we get the familiar menu with the different rack combinations. And from here, we can also copy. Let's say I'll go to this one, copy it. Then I can paste it into another one. Great if you want to create variations of the same chain. Now we also have input and output level knobs for each rack. Again, great for gain staging and blending them all together. And we have also the ability here to set the input and output channels for each rack right in this window. So if I click here, I can change the setup that I've established in the setup window in there from the gear icon if I want to, or you can just deal with this on its own straight from here. So that's for the input and that's for the output. And I've got them defined as mono. But of course, back here, I can always go and change them to stereo if I want. We have the ability to turn side chaining on and off individually for each rack. And we set the input here for the sidechain input. And we can monitor the sidechain with these buttons, again, available for each rack. Now, in addition to saving each of the rack presets, we can save the entire song, again, with that idea of using this live on stage for a band. So we have a song preset field at the upper left to save the state of all the racks together, or we can initialize them and just empty everything out. So if we go to the Save As menu, we'll get the familiar dialog box. And again, it'll bring us to the menu we're used to seeing in the same location: User, Documents, IK Multimedia, Mixbox, and in this case, Song Presets. So what I can do now instead, if I want, is just go there and initialize everything. And all my racks are empty. Now with these rack thumbnails at the top, we not only get a power button, but while it's processing audio, we'll get an LED green or red to show the current signal status when modules are loaded in, of course. Now the left bar, let me load in something just so we have something here. And we'll go back to our regular view. Left bar, we have, I've loaded that into slot 1 rather. So we have the input metering over here. We have the input volume control. Again, here for side chaining, we can set the specific input that we want and monitor it. And this is unique for each rack, of course. They see the level updates for each one, as does the sidechain and the monitoring status. Here we get the dry wet slider like we saw in the plugin version. And here we get the module presets that are available. We can also set the input and output channels for each rack in this view. So for the input field, we can click up here and again, make changes to what's in the I/O setup. And on the right side, we can set the output channel for each rack over here. And we can even disconnect it or open up the setup window if we want directly from there. So we have the output metering, output level, again, different for each rack. You see how it changes and updates. And then we have CPU usage for the rack. And finally, here we get to the familiar rack edit panel like we saw in the last video for the plugin version. And it works pretty much the same. We have modules numbered from 1 to 8. Each module has its own output level slider and solo button. And we get the sidechain button where applicable for dynamics processing. And at the bottom, we can load or save full rack setups, as we've seen. We can also initialize them. And we can copy paste like we've seen before. And we can even select different racks from here. So let's say I want to load something into rack 2. Then I can switch to rack 3, load it directly in from here. So whatever view you're in, you can get around pretty well. Those are the basics for getting around the standalone version of Mixbox. Next video, we're going to start putting it to work and hear what these modules sound like.